Husband leaves his wife after their child is born with bright blue eyes, but he had no idea that the baby was part of something rare. Rachel stood at the kitchen sink, her hands submerged in soapy water as she absently scrubbed a plate. Her gaze drifted to the window, where the setting sun painted the sky in the hues of orange and pink. The quiet suburban street outside seemed to mirror the tranquility of her life, or so she thought. At 28, Rachel had it all figured out. A loving husband, a successful career as a graphic designer, and now a baby on the way. She smiled, her free hand instinctively moving to her swollen belly. Just 2 more weeks until their little miracle would arrive. "Hey, beautiful," a deep voice called from behind her. Greg, her husband of 5 years, wrapped his arms around her waist, his hands resting gently on her stomach. "How are my 2 favorite people doing today?" Rachel leaned back into his embrace, relishing the warmth and security she felt in his arms. "We're good. Little one's been kicking up a storm, though. I think we've got a future soccer player on our hands." Greg chuckled, his breath tickling her ear. "Well, as long as they don't kick their way out before we're ready." Rachel turned in his arms, facing her husband. His kind brown eyes crinkled at the corners as he smiled down at her. She reached up, running her fingers through his salt and pepper hair. At 32, Greg was already showing signs of graying, but Rachel found it endearing. It gave him a distinguished look that suited his position as a high school history teacher. "I finished the nursery today," Greg said, excitement evident in his voice. "Want to see?" Rachel nodded eagerly, allowing Greg to lead her up the stairs of their modest 2-story home. As they reached the 2nd floor, Greg covered her eyes with his hands. "No peeking," he warned playfully. Rachel felt a flutter of anticipation in her chest as Greg guided her forward. She heard the soft creak of a door opening, and then Greg's hands fell away from her eyes. "Surprise!" Rachel gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. The nursery was beautiful. Soft yellow walls were adorned with whimsical animal decals. A white crib stood in the corner, a mobile of stars and moons hanging above it. A rocking chair sat by the window, a handmade quilt draped over its back. "Oh, Greg," Rachel breathed, tears welling in her eyes. "It's perfect." Greg beamed with pride. "I wanted everything to be just right for our little one." Rachel turned to her husband, overwhelmed with love and gratitude. "You're going to be an amazing father. You know that?" Greg's expression softened, a hint of vulnerability crossing his features. "You really think so? Sometimes I worry. My own dad wasn't exactly the best role model." Rachel cupped his face in her hands, her blue eyes meeting his brown ones. "You are not your father, Greg. You're kind, patient, and so full of love. Our baby is lucky to have you." Greg leaned in, pressing his forehead against hers. "We're both lucky to have you," he murmured. As they stood there basking in the moment, Rachel felt a sharp pain in her abdomen. She winced, pulling away from Greg. "Rachel, what's wrong?" Greg's voice was laced with concern. Rachel took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. I think it might be time." Greg's eyes widened, a mix of excitement and panic flashing across his face. "But it's 2 weeks early!" Rachel managed a small laugh despite the discomfort. "I don't think the baby got the memo." Greg sprang into action, his earlier nervousness replaced by determination. "Okay, don't panic. We've got this. I'll grab the hospital bag. You just focus on breathing." As Greg rushed around the house, gathering their things, Rachel stood in the nursery, one hand on her belly, the other gripping the edge of the crib for support. She looked around the room, at all the love and care that had gone into preparing for their child's arrival. A wave of emotion washed over her, excitement, fear, and an overwhelming sense of joy. "Ready?" Greg appeared in the doorway, slightly out of breath, hospital bag slung over his shoulder. Rachel nodded, reaching out to take his hand. As they made their way down the stairs and out to the car, she couldn't help but feel that everything in her life had led to this moment. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she knew that with Greg by her side, they could face anything. Little did they know, their greatest test was just beginning. The hospital corridor buzzed with activity as Rachel was wheeled into the delivery room, Greg by her side, clutching her hand tightly. The harsh fluorescent lights and antiseptic smell were a stark contrast to the warm, cozy nursery they had left behind. "You're doing great, honey," Greg encouraged, his voice steady despite the nervousness in his eyes. Rachel managed a weak smile through her pain, grateful for his presence. Dr. Martinez, their obstetrician, greeted them with a reassuring smile. "Looks like someone's eager to meet the world," she said, checking Rachel's vitals. "How are you feeling, Rachel?" "Like I'm being torn in half," Rachel gasped, gripping the sides of the bed as another contraction hit. The next few hours passed in a blur of pain, encouragement, and anticipation. Greg remained a constant presence, wiping Rachel's brow, offering ice chips, and whispering words of love and support. As dawn broke, painting the sky outside in soft pinks and blues, a new cry filled the room. "Congratulations, Doctor." Martinez beamed, holding up a squirming bundle. "It's a beautiful baby boy." Rachel collapsed back against the pillows, exhausted but elated. Greg leaned in, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "You did it, sweetheart. You're amazing." The nurse cleaned and swaddled the baby before placing him in Rachel's arms. As Rachel gazed down at her son for the first time, her breath caught in her throat. Nestled in the blankets, the baby blinked up at her with eyes of the most startling, vivid blue she had ever seen. "Oh my," Rachel whispered, awestruck. "Greg, look at his eyes. They're so beautiful." Greg leaned in for a closer look, his brow furrowing slightly. "Blue? That's unexpected." Rachel barely registered the hint of confusion in Greg's voice, too captivated by her son's gaze. "They're like sapphires," she marveled. Dr. Martinez approached, smiling at the new family. "He's a handsome little fellow. Have you decided on a name?" Rachel and Greg exchanged a look. They had discussed names but hadn't settled on one yet. In that moment, looking into those striking blue eyes, Rachel knew. "Ethan," she said softly. "Ethan James Cooper." Greg nodded, a small smile playing on his lips. "Ethan. It suits him." As the initial excitement settled, Greg's expression grew pensive. He excused himself, saying he needed some air. Rachel, still basking in the glow of new motherhood, barely noticed his departure. A nurse entered the room, offering to take Ethan to the nursery so Rachel could rest. Rachel hesitated, reluctant to let go of her precious bundle. "Don't worry, dear," the nurse assured her. "We'll bring him back for feeding in a couple of hours. You need your rest." Reluctantly, Rachel handed Ethan over, her eyes following the nurse as she left the room. As the door closed, the reality of what had just happened began to sink in. She was a mother. She and Greg had created this perfect little being. Greg, where was he? Rachel frowned, realizing he had been gone for quite a while. Just as she was about to ask a nurse to look for him, the door opened and Greg walked in. "Hey," Rachel said softly, reaching out for him. "Where'd you go?" "You missed the nurse taking Ethan to the nursery." Greg approached the bed slowly, his face unreadable. "I was just thinking." Rachel's smile faltered. Something in Greg's tone set off a small alarm in her mind. "Thinking? About what?" Greg sat on the edge of the bed, his gaze fixed on his hands. "Rachel, I don't know how to ask this, but is there something you need to tell me?" Rachel blinked, confusion clouding her features. "What do you mean?" Greg finally looked up, his brown eyes filled with an emotion Rachel couldn't quite place. "The baby's eyes, Rachel. They're blue, bright blue." "I know," Rachel said, still not understanding. "They're beautiful, aren't they?" Greg's jaw tightened. "Rachel, neither of us has blue eyes. How is that possible?" The implication of Greg's words hit Rachel like a physical blow. She stared at her husband, disbelief and hurt warring in her chest. "Greg, what are you saying?" "I'm saying," Greg replied, his voice strained, "that I think you owe me an explanation." As the weight of Greg's accusation settled over the room, the joy of Ethan's birth gave way to a tension that crackled like electricity. Rachel's world, so perfect just moments ago, began to crumble around her. Rachel's heart pounded in her chest as she stared at Greg, his words echoing in her mind. The sterile hospital room suddenly felt suffocating, the beeping of machines a distant, mocking rhythm. "Greg," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, Are you accusing me of cheating on you?" Greg ran a hand through his hair, his expression a mix of anger and pain. "What am I supposed to think, Rachel? Our son has bright blue eyes. It doesn't make sense." Rachel struggled to sit up, wincing at the discomfort. "It doesn't make sense because it's not true. How could you even think that?" "Then explain it to me," Greg demanded, his voice rising. "Explain how our brown-eyed genes suddenly produced a blue-eyed baby." Rachel's mind raced, trying to recall anything from her high school biology classes that could explain this. I don't know, Greg. Maybe it's a recessive gene or something, but I swear to you, I have never been unfaithful." Greg stood up abruptly, pacing the small room. "A recessive gene? That's convenient, isn't it?" Tears welled up in Rachel's eyes. "Greg, please, you're not thinking clearly. We just had a baby. Our baby. How can you be focusing on this right now?" A knock at the door interrupted their tense exchange. A nurse entered, pushing a small bassinet. "Someone's ready for his feeding," she announced cheerfully, oblivious to the tension in the room. Rachel reached for Ethan, cradling him close. As she gazed down at her son, his bright blue eyes staring back at her, she felt a surge of love and protectiveness. "Greg," she said softly, looking up at her husband, "look at him. Really look at him. He has your nose, your chin. He's your son." Greg approached hesitantly, his eyes fixed on the baby. For a moment, his expression softened, and Rachel felt a glimmer of hope. But then he shook his head, stepping back. "I need some time," he muttered, heading for the door. I can't do this right now." "Greg, wait," Rachel called after him, but he was already gone. She looked down at Ethan, who had started to fuss. "It's okay, baby," she whispered, tears falling freely now. "It's going to be okay." The next few days passed in a blur of sleepless nights and tense silences. Greg returned to the hospital, but remained distant, his interactions with Rachel and Ethan stilted and uncomfortable. Rachel tried repeatedly to talk to him, to make him see reason, but Greg seemed to have built a wall around himself. On the day of their discharge, Rachel watched as Greg mechanically packed their belongings, barely looking at her or the baby. "Greg," she said, her voice trembling, "we need to talk about this. We can't go home like this." Greg paused, his back to her. "I don't know what to say, Rachel. I don't know what to think." "Think about our 5 years together," Rachel pleaded. "Think about all we've been through, all we've shared. Does that mean nothing?" Greg turned to face her, his eyes red-rimmed and tired. "It means everything, Rachel. That's why this hurts so much." Rachel stood up, Ethan secure in her arms. "Then let's figure this out together. We can get a paternity test if that's what you need. But please don't throw away our family over this." Greg's gaze flickered to Ethan, a mix of emotions crossing his face. For a moment, Rachel thought she saw a glimmer of the love and excitement he had shown just days ago. But then his expression hardened. "A paternity test," he said flatly. "Fine, we'll do that." Rachel felt a small sense of relief. At least this was something concrete, a way to prove her faithfulness. "Thank you," she said softly. The drive home was silent, the car thick with unspoken words and suppressed emotions. As they pulled into their driveway, Rachel couldn't help but remember how differently she had imagined this moment. The three of them coming home as a happy family, ready to start their new life together. Instead, as Greg carried their bags inside, Rachel stood in the doorway of their home, Ethan nestled against her chest, feeling like a stranger in her own life. The nursery upstairs, so lovingly prepared, now seemed like a cruel reminder of the joy they had lost. As night fell, Rachel sat in the rocking chair, gently soothing Ethan to sleep. She looked up to see Greg standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "I'll sleep in the guest room," he said quietly. Rachel nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. As Greg turned to leave, she found her voice. "Greg," she called softly. He paused but didn't turn around. "I love you. We'll get through this." Greg's shoulders tensed, and for a moment Rachel thought he might respond. But then he walked away, leaving Rachel alone with their son and the weight of unspoken doubts between them. The weeks following Ethan's birth passed in a haze of sleepless nights and tense days. Rachel found herself navigating the challenges of new motherhood while grappling with the growing chasm between her and Greg. The paternity test loomed over them, a silent specter haunting their every interaction. One morning, as Rachel sat at the kitchen table, Ethan nestled in her arms. She heard Greg's footsteps on the stairs. He entered the kitchen, his eyes immediately drawn to the baby. "Good morning," Rachel ventured, offering a tentative smile. Greg nodded, his expression guarded. "Morning." He poured himself a cup of coffee, his movements stiff and mechanical. Rachel took a deep breath, steeling herself. "Greg, we need to talk about the paternity test. It's been weeks, and we can't keep living like this." Greg's hand tightened around his mug. "I've made an appointment for next week," he said, his voice flat. Relief washed over Rachel. "Thank you," she said softly. "I know this will clear everything up." Greg's gaze flickered to Ethan, his expression softening for a moment before hardening again. "We'll see," he muttered. As Greg turned to leave, Ethan began to fuss. Without thinking, Rachel held him out. "Would you like to hold him?" Greg hesitated, conflict evident in his eyes. For a moment, Rachel thought he might refuse, but then he stepped forward, carefully taking Ethan into his arms. As he looked down at the baby, a mix of emotions played across his face. Love, doubt, fear. Ethan blinked up at Greg, his bright blue eyes wide and curious. Greg's breath caught, and Rachel saw a flicker of the man she fell in love with, the kind, gentle soul who had been so excited to become a father. "He has your smile," Greg said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. Rachel felt a glimmer of hope. "He does," she agreed. "And your chin, your nose." Greg nodded, still gazing at Ethan. For a few precious moments, they stood there, a family united. But then, as if remembering himself, Greg handed Ethan back to Rachel. "I have to get to work," he said, his voice once again distant. As Greg left for school, Rachel couldn't help but feel that a small breakthrough had occurred. It wasn't much, but it was something to hold on to. The day of the paternity test arrived, bringing with it a storm of emotions. At the clinic, Rachel watched as the technician gently swabbed the inside of Ethan's cheek, then Greg's. The process was quick and painless, but the weight of its implications hung heavy in the air. "We'll have the results in about a week," the technician informed them. The drive home was silent, each lost in their own thoughts. As they pulled into their driveway, Greg spoke. I think I should stay with my brother until we get the results." Rachel felt as if the ground had dropped out from beneath her. "Greg, please, don't do this. We can face this together." Greg shook his head, unable to meet her eyes. "I need some space to think, Rachel. This past month has been... I just need some time." Tears welled in Rachel's eyes as she watched Greg pack a bag. As he headed for the door, she called out, "Greg, no matter what those results say, I have never stopped loving you." Greg paused, his hand on the doorknob. For a moment, Rachel thought he might turn back. But then he was gone, leaving her alone with Ethan and a house full of memories. The days crawled by, each one a test of Rachel's strength and resilience. She threw herself into caring for Ethan, finding solace in his innocent smiles and soft coos. Her mother came to stay, offering support and a shoulder to cry on. "You're stronger than you know, sweetheart," her mother said one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset. "No matter what happens, you'll get through this." Rachel nodded, drawing strength from her mother's words. As she looked down at Ethan, peacefully sleeping in her arms, she made a silent vow. No matter what the test results showed, no matter what Greg decided, she would be the best mother she could be. Ethan deserved nothing less. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon. Rachel's hands shook as she answered the phone, her heart pounding in her chest. As she listened to the nurse on the other end, a wave of emotions washed over her. Relief, vindication, and a renewed determination. With trembling fingers, she dialed Greg's number. When he answered, his voice wary, Rachel took a deep breath. "The results are in," she said, her voice steady despite the tears threatening to fall. "It's time to talk." The living room was bathed in the soft glow of the afternoon sun as Rachel sat on the couch, Ethan sleeping peacefully in his bassinet nearby. She heard the crunch of gravel in the driveway, and her heart rate quickened. Moments later, the front door opened, and Greg stepped inside, his face a mask of apprehension. "Hi," Rachel said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Greg nodded, his eyes darting between Rachel and Ethan. "Hey," he replied, his voice equally quiet. Rachel gestured to the armchair across from her. "Please, sit down." Greg lowered himself into the chair, his posture rigid. For a moment, neither spoke, the ticking of the clock on the mantel the only sound in the room. Finally, Rachel broke the silence. "I got the results from the clinic," she said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. Greg leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. "And?" he asked, his voice a mix of fear and hope. Rachel took a deep breath. "Greg, you are Ethan's father. The test confirms it without a doubt." The words hung in the air between them. Greg's shoulders sagged, a myriad of emotions flashing across his face. Relief, shame, confusion. I don't understand," he said, running a hand through his hair. "How is this possible?" Rachel reached for a folder on the coffee table. "I did some research," she explained, pulling out a printout. "It's called a genetic throwback. Apparently, my grandfather had blue eyes. The gene can skip generations." Greg took the paper, his eyes scanning the information. "I had no idea," he murmured. "Neither did I," Rachel admitted. "I barely remember my grandfather. He passed away when I was very young." A heavy silence fell between them. Greg's gaze drifted to Ethan, who was beginning to stir in his bassinet. "Rachel, Greg began, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't know what to say. I've been such a fool." Rachel felt a lump form in her throat. "You hurt me, Greg. Deeply. You doubted me. Doubted us." Greg nodded, unable to meet her eyes. "I know. I let my insecurities get the best of me. I jumped to conclusions instead of trusting in our love, in our history together." Rachel watched as Greg stood up and walked over to Ethan's bassinet. He gently picked up the now awake baby, cradling him close. "Hey there, little guy," Greg whispered, his voice choked with emotion. "I'm so sorry. Daddy's so sorry." Tears welled in Rachel's eyes as she watched the tender moment between father and son. Part of her wanted to rush over, to embrace them both and pretend the last few weeks had never happened. But the hurt was still too raw, the trust too damaged. Greg looked up at Rachel, his eyes brimming with unshed tears. "Can you ever forgive me?" he asked. Rachel took a shaky breath. "I want to, Greg, but it's not that simple. You walked out on us. You left me alone when I needed you most." Greg nodded, gently rocking Ethan. "I know. I made a terrible mistake. I let fear and doubt poison everything we had. We built a life together," Rachel continued, her voice trembling. "We made vows. How do we come back from this?" Greg carefully placed Ethan back in the bassinet before kneeling in front of Rachel. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I want to try. If you'll let me, I want to spend the rest of my life making this up to you." To Ethan. Rachel looked into Greg's eyes, seeing the sincerity, the regret, the love that had been clouded by doubt. "It won't be easy," she warned. "I know," Greg agreed, "but you and Ethan are worth fighting for. Our family is worth fighting for." Rachel felt a glimmer of hope in her chest. It was small, fragile, but it was there. "We'll need counseling," she said, "to work through this, to rebuild trust." Greg nodded eagerly. "Anything. I'll do anything." Rachel reached out, taking Greg's hand in hers. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a start. "One day at a time," she said softly. As if sensing the shift in the room, Ethan let out a soft coo. Rachel and Greg both turned to look at their son, his bright blue eyes wide and curious. "He really does have your smile," Greg said, a hint of wonder in his voice. Rachel felt the corners of her mouth turn up slightly. "And your chin," she replied. As they sat there, hands intertwined, watching their son, Rachel knew the road ahead would be challenging. Trust, once broken, is not easily mended. But as she looked at Greg, saw the love and determination in his eyes, she felt a flicker of hope for their future. They had weathered a storm, but perhaps with time and effort, they could rebuild something even stronger. The weeks that followed were a delicate dance of rebuilding trust and relearning each other. Greg moved back into the house, but into the guest room, giving Rachel the space she needed while still being present for Ethan. They attended counseling sessions twice a week, unpacking the hurt and miscommunication that had led to their near breakup. One crisp autumn morning, Rachel sat on the porch swing, a steaming mug of tea in her hands. The leaves on the maple tree in their front yard had begun to turn, painting the world in warm hues of red and gold. She heard the screen door open behind her and turned to see Greg, Ethan cradled in his arms. "Mind if we join you?" Greg asked, his voice tentative. Rachel nodded, scooting over to make room. Greg sat down, careful not to disturb the sleeping Ethan. "He's getting so big," Rachel mused, reaching out to stroke Ethan's cheek. Greg smiled, a genuine warmth in his eyes that Rachel had missed. "He is. I can't believe he's already 3 months old." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching as the neighborhood slowly came to life. An elderly couple walked by, hand in hand, and waved at them. Rachel and Greg waved back, presenting a picture of domestic tranquility that belied the turmoil they were still working through. "I've been thinking," Greg said suddenly, his voice soft so as not to wake Ethan, "about everything that happened, about how I reacted." Rachel tensed slightly, but nodded for him to continue. "I realized that it wasn't just about Ethan's eyes," Greg admitted. "It was about my own insecurities, my fears of not being good enough." Rachel turned to face him, surprised by his candor. "What do you mean?" Greg sighed, gently adjusting Ethan in his arms. "Growing up, my dad always made me feel like I wasn't enough. No matter what I did, it was never good enough for him. I guess part of me always feared I'd turn out to be like him." Rachel felt a pang in her heart. Despite their years together, Greg had rarely opened up about his childhood. "Oh, Greg," she said softly. "When I saw Ethan's eyes," Greg continued, "all those old insecurities came rushing back. Instead of trusting in us, in you, I let those fears take over. I convinced myself that of course you'd find someone better, someone more worthy of you and our child." Rachel reached out, placing her hand on Greg's arm. "You are worthy, Greg. You're a wonderful father and a good man. Your father's shortcomings are not yours." Greg's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "I know that now, or at least I'm learning to believe it. Our counselor has been helping me work through a lot of this." Rachel felt a warmth bloom in her chest. This was the man she had fallen in love with. Vulnerable, honest, always striving to be better. "I'm proud of you," she said softly, "for doing the work, for facing these fears." Greg gave her a small, grateful smile. "I couldn't have done it without you, without your forgiveness and patience." Rachel squeezed his arm gently. "We're in this together, remember? For better or for worse." As if on cue, Ethan began to stir, his tiny fists waving in the air as he yawned. His bright blue eyes blinked open, focusing on his parents. "Hey there, little man," Greg cooed, his voice filled with love. "Did you have a good nap?" Ethan gurgled in response, a toothless smile lighting up his face. Rachel felt her heart swell with love for her little family. "You know," she said, a hint of mischief in her voice, "I think he's starting to look more like you every day." Greg chuckled, the sound warm and genuine. "Poor kid," he joked, but Rachel could see the pride shining in his eyes. As they sat there on the porch swing, the morning sun warming their faces, Rachel felt a sense of peace settle over her. They still had a long way to go, trust to rebuild and wounds to heal. But in that moment, with Greg by her side and Ethan in his arms, she knew they were on the right path. "What do you say we go for a walk?" Greg suggested. "It's a beautiful day, and I think we could all use some fresh air." Rachel nodded, standing up and stretching. "That sounds perfect." As they made their way down the porch steps, Ethan securely strapped to Greg's chest in a baby carrier, Rachel felt Greg's hand slip into hers. She looked up at him, seeing the question in his eyes, and gave his hand a gentle squeeze. It wasn't forgiveness, not completely, but it was progress. One step at a time, they were finding their way back to each other. As autumn gave way to winter, the Cooper household settled into a new rhythm. Rachel had returned to work part-time, balancing her graphic design projects with motherhood. Greg, now back in the classroom, threw himself into his teaching with renewed vigor, often sharing amusing anecdotes about his students over dinner. One chilly December evening, Rachel sat at her desk, putting the finishing touches on a logo design. The house was quiet, save for the soft lullaby drifting from the baby monitor. She heard the front door open and close, followed by the familiar sound of Greg's footsteps. "Rachel?" Greg called softly, appearing in the doorway of her home office. "You got a minute?" Rachel saved her work and swiveled her chair to face him. "Sure, what's up?" Greg entered the room, a nervous energy about him. I wanted to talk to you about something." Rachel felt a flicker of apprehension. Despite the progress they'd made, moments like these still triggered a residual anxiety. "Okay," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. Greg took a deep breath. "I've been thinking a lot about us, about our family, and I want to renew our vows." Rachel blinked, surprised. Of all the things she had expected him to say, this wasn't one of them. "Renew our vows?" Greg nodded, his eyes earnest. "I know we've been working hard on rebuilding our relationship, and I feel like we've come so far, but I want to make a public commitment to you and to Ethan that I'm in this for the long haul." Rachel felt a lump form in her throat. "Greg, You don't have to answer right now," Greg rushed to add. "I know it's a big decision. I want you to know how serious I am about us, about our future." Rachel stood up, closing the distance between them. She reached out, taking Greg's hands in hers. "It is a big decision," she agreed, "but I think it's a beautiful idea." Greg's face lit up. "Really? You mean it?" Rachel nodded, a smile tugging at her lips. "I do. I think it would be good for us, for our family. A fresh start." Greg pulled her into a tight embrace, and Rachel felt herself melting into his arms. It felt right, like coming home after a long journey. As they pulled apart, Rachel saw tears glistening in Greg's eyes. "I love you, Rachel," he said softly. "I know I messed up, and I'm still working on being the man you and Ethan deserve. But I promise, I'll spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of your love." Rachel felt her own eyes welling up. "Oh, Greg," she whispered, "you are worthy. We both made mistakes, but we're working through them together. That's what matters." Just then, a cry came through the baby monitor. Greg chuckled, wiping his eyes. "Looks like someone wants to join the celebration." They made their way to the nursery, where Ethan was standing in his crib, his little hands gripping the rails. His bright blue eyes lit up at the sight of his parents. "Hey there, champ," Greg said, scooping Ethan up. "Guess what? Mommy and Daddy are going to have a special party to show how much we love each other and you." Ethan babbled happily, reaching out to pat Greg's face. Rachel watched them, her heart full. This was her family, imperfect but strong, resilient in the face of challenges. "So," Greg said, turning to Rachel with a grin, "when should we do this? Spring wedding? Summer?" Rachel laughed, the sound light and carefree. "Let's not get ahead of ourselves. We've got plenty of time to plan." As they stood there in the nursery, Ethan babbling between them, Rachel felt a sense of excitement building. This vow renewal wasn't just about reaffirming their commitment to each other. It was about celebrating the family they had created, the obstacles they had overcome, and the future they were building together. "You know," Rachel mused, "maybe we could do it on Ethan's first birthday. Make it a real family celebration." Greg's eyes lit up. "That's perfect. A new beginning for all of us." As they began to discuss ideas for the ceremony, Rachel felt a warmth spreading through her chest. The past year had been a roller coaster of emotions, filled with highs and lows she never could have anticipated. But standing here now, with Greg and Ethan, she knew that every challenge had only made them stronger. Their love story wasn't perfect, but it was real. And as they looked to the future, Rachel knew that whatever life threw their way, they would face it together, as a family. The months leading up to Ethan's first birthday and Greg and Rachel's vow renewal were a whirlwind of activity. Between planning the ceremony, keeping up with their careers, and chasing after an increasingly mobile Ethan, the Coopers found themselves busier than ever. One sunny Saturday morning, Rachel sat at the kitchen table, surrounded by color swatches and flower catalogs. Ethan was in his high chair, happily mashing banana between his fingers and occasionally getting some in his mouth. "What do you think, sweetie?" Rachel asked, holding up two different shades of blue. "Which one matches your eyes better?" Ethan responded by flinging a piece of banana, which landed with impressive accuracy on one of the swatches. Rachel laughed, wiping it off. "Well, I guess that's a vote for cerulean." Greg walked in, his hair tousled from sleep. "Morning, you two," he said, dropping a kiss on Rachel's cheek and ruffling Ethan's hair. "How's the planning going?" Rachel sighed, gesturing at the chaos on the table. "Overwhelming. Who knew renewing vows could be just as complicated as the original wedding?" Greg chuckled, pouring himself a cup of coffee. "We could always elope. Take Ethan, head to Vegas." Rachel shot him a playful glare. "Don't tempt me. But no, I want to do this right. For us, for Ethan, for our families." Greg nodded, his expression turning serious. "I do too. After everything we've been through, we deserve to celebrate." Just then, Ethan let out a squeal, drawing their attention. He was reaching for Greg, his chubby arms outstretched, banana forgotten. "Da-da!" Ethan exclaimed, clear as day. Rachel and Greg froze, staring at their son in amazement. "Did he just?" Rachel whispered. Greg nodded, his eyes wide. "I think he did. Ethan, buddy, can you say that again?" "Da-da!" Ethan repeated, bouncing in his high chair with excitement. Rachel felt tears welling up in her eyes as she watched Greg scoop Ethan up, pride and joy radiating from him. It was a moment of pure happiness, untainted by the struggles of the past year. "Oh, my clever boy," Greg cooed, peppering Ethan's face with kisses. "Can you say mama too?" Ethan giggled, burying his face in Greg's shoulder. "Da-da," he said again, softer this time. Rachel stood up, wrapping her arms around both of them. "It's okay," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "He'll say mama when he's ready." As they stood there, embracing as a family, Rachel felt a sense of peace wash over her. This was what it was all about. These small, precious moments that made all the challenges worthwhile. Later that evening, after Ethan had been put to bed, Rachel and Greg sat on the porch swing, enjoying the warm spring air. "I've been thinking," Greg said, his voice thoughtful, "about our vows." Rachel turned to look at him. "Oh, having second thoughts about the Elvis impersonator?" she teased. Greg laughed, shaking his head. No, nothing like that. I want to make sure my vows reflect everything we've been through, everything I've learned. Rachel nodded, understanding the weight of his words. What did you have in mind? Greg took a deep breath. I want to promise to always communicate, to never let my insecurities cloud my judgment, to be the kind of father Ethan deserves, and the husband you deserve. Rachel felt her heart swell with love. Those are beautiful vows, Greg. What about you? Greg asked. Have you thought about yours? Rachel was quiet for a moment, gathering her thoughts. I want to vow to always have faith in us, in our love, to remember that we're stronger together, even when times get tough, and to never take our family for granted. Greg reached out, taking her hand in his. I love that, he said softly. As they sat there hand in hand, Rachel felt a sense of excitement building. In just a few short weeks, they would be standing before their friends and family, reaffirming their love and commitment to each other. You know, Rachel mused, a year ago, I never would have imagined we'd be here, planning to renew our vows. Greg squeezed her hand. A lot can change in a year, but I'm grateful for where we've ended up. Rachel leaned her head on Greg's shoulder, feeling content. Me too, she whispered. As the sun set, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink, Rachel and Greg sat in comfortable silence, each lost in their own thoughts. The past year had been a journey of growth, forgiveness, and rediscovery. And as they looked to the future, to their upcoming vow renewal and the life they were building with Ethan, both felt a sense of hope and excitement for what was to come. Their love story had taken an unexpected turn, but in facing their challenges head-on, they had emerged stronger, more committed, and more in love than ever before. The day of Ethan's first birthday and Greg and Rachel's vow renewal dawned bright and clear. The Coopers' backyard had been transformed into a whimsical wonderland, with twinkling lights strung between trees and colorful balloons bobbing gently in the breeze. Rachel stood in front of the mirror in their bedroom, smoothing down her simple white sundress. Her hair was adorned with a crown of wildflowers, a nod to the natural beauty of their backyard ceremony. A soft knock at the door drew her attention. "Come in," she called. Her mother entered carrying Ethan, who was dressed in an adorable little suit. "Oh, sweetheart," her mother breathed, tears glistening in her eyes. "You look beautiful." Rachel smiled, reaching out to take Ethan. "Thank you, Mom. And look at you, my handsome little man," she cooed, planting a kiss on Ethan's cheek. Ethan giggled, his bright blue eyes sparkling with joy. "Mama," he said, patting Rachel's face with his chubby hands. Rachel felt her heart swell. Ethan had finally said Mama just a week ago, and hearing it still filled her with indescribable happiness. "Are you ready?" her mother asked gently. Rachel took a deep breath, nodding. "I am. More than ready." As they made their way downstairs, Rachel could hear the soft murmur of guests gathering in the backyard. Her father met them at the bottom of the stairs, his eyes misty as he took in the sight of his daughter and grandson. "You look radiant, sweetheart," he said, leaning in to kiss her cheek. Rachel smiled, handing Ethan to her mother. "Thanks, Dad. Is Greg?" "He's waiting for you," her father assured her, offering his arm. "Shall we?" As they stepped into the backyard, a hush fell over the gathered friends and family. Rachel's eyes immediately found Greg, standing beneath an arch adorned with flowers and greenery. His face lit up as he saw her, love and adoration clear in his expression. Rachel's father guided her down the makeshift aisle, lined with rose petals and twinkling candles. When they reached Greg, her father placed her hand in his, giving them both a warm smile before taking his seat. The officiant, a close friend of theirs, began the ceremony with a warm welcome to all gathered. As he spoke about love, commitment, and the journey of marriage, Rachel found herself reflecting on the past year, the challenges they had faced, the growth they had experienced, and the unbreakable bond they had forged. When it came time for the vows, Greg went first. He took a deep breath, his eyes never leaving Rachel's. "Rachel," he began, his voice filled with emotion, "a year ago, I nearly lost the most precious thing in my life, our family. My insecurities and fears almost destroyed what we had built together. But through your strength, your patience, and your unwavering love, we found our way back to each other." He paused, blinking back tears. "I stand here today, in front of our friends, our family, and our beautiful son, to make these vows to you. I promise to always communicate openly and honestly, to never let my doubts overshadow my trust in us. I vow to be the husband you deserve and the father Ethan needs, to love you both fiercely and unconditionally through all of life's ups and downs. You are my heart, my home, and my future. I love you, Rachel, more than words can express." Rachel felt tears streaming down her cheeks as she listened to Greg's heartfelt words. When it was her turn, she took a moment to compose herself before speaking. "Greg," she began, her voice soft but steady, "our journey hasn't been easy, but it has been ours. Through every challenge, every misunderstanding, and every moment of doubt, our love has endured. It has grown stronger, deeper, and more resilient." She squeezed his hands gently. "Today, I vow to always have faith in us, in the power of our love to overcome any obstacle. I promise to be your partner in all things, to support your dreams and share your burdens, to remember that we are strongest when we stand together, and to cherish every moment of the beautiful life we're building with our son." Rachel glanced over at Ethan, who was contentedly nestled in her mother's arms. "You are my best friend, my soulmate, and the father of our child. I love you, Greg, with all that I am and all that I will be." As they exchanged rings, simple bands engraved with the words, "Our love, our strength," Rachel felt a sense of completion. They had come full circle, emerging from their trials stronger and more in love than ever. The officiant pronounced them husband and wife, and as Greg leaned in to kiss her, the backyard erupted in cheers and applause. Rachel laughed against Greg's lips, feeling lighter than she had in months. As they turned to face their guests, Ethan let out a joyful squeal. Greg scooped him up, and the three of them stood together, a family united in love and commitment. In that moment, surrounded by the people they loved most, Rachel knew that whatever challenges the future might hold, they would face them together, stronger, wiser, and more devoted than ever before. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm glow over the Coopers' backyard, the celebration of Ethan's first birthday and Greg and Rachel's vow renewal was in full swing. Laughter and music filled the air, mingling with the delighted squeals of children playing. Rachel stood at the edge of the makeshift dance floor, watching as Greg twirled Ethan in his arms, both of them beaming with joy. Her heart swelled with love for her little family, marveling at how far they had come in just 1 year. "Penny for your thoughts?" a familiar voice said beside her. Rachel turned to see her best friend Sarah holding out a glass of champagne. Rachel accepted the glass with a smile. "Just thinking about how different things were a year ago, how close we came to losing everything." Sarah nodded, her expression understanding. "But you didn't. You fought for your family, both of you. And look at you now." As if on cue, Greg approached with Ethan, both slightly out of breath from their dancing. "Mind if we cut in?" Greg asked with a grin. "Not at all," Sarah laughed, taking Ethan from Greg's arms. "Come on, little man. Let's go find you some cake." As Sarah walked away with a giggling Ethan, Greg pulled Rachel close, swaying gently to the soft music. "Happy?" he murmured into her hair. "Incredibly," Rachel replied, leaning into his embrace. "I love you, Greg." "I love you too," Greg said, his voice filled with emotion. "More than I ever thought possible." As they danced, Rachel found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought them to this moment. The shock and hurt of Greg's initial accusation, the pain of separation, the slow process of rebuilding trust. It had all led them here, to this night of renewed love and commitment. The song ended, and Rachel saw her parents approaching, Ethan in her mother's arms. "I think someone's ready for bed," her mother said softly, handing the sleepy toddler to Rachel. Rachel cradled Ethan close, breathing in his sweet baby scent. "We'll put him down," she said, looking at Greg. "Can you keep an eye on things out here?" Greg nodded, dropping a kiss on Ethan's forehead before Rachel carried him inside. As she laid Ethan in his crib, gently tucking his favorite blanket around him, Rachel felt a wave of gratitude wash over her. "Sweet dreams, my little blue-eyed miracle," she whispered, stroking his cheek. Returning to the party, Rachel found Greg deep in conversation with his brother. As she approached, she overheard snippets of their discussion. "Never thought I'd be this happy," Greg was saying, his voice filled with wonder. His brother clapped him on the shoulder. "You deserve it, man. Both of you do." As the night wore on, guests began to depart, offering warm hugs and congratulations. Finally, as the last car pulled away, Rachel and Greg found themselves alone in their backyard, surrounded by the remnants of the celebration. "Well, Mrs. Cooper," Greg said, pulling Rachel close, "what do you say we call it a night?" Rachel smiled up at him, her eyes twinkling. "I say that sounds perfect, Mr. Cooper." As they made their way inside, hand in hand, Rachel paused in the living room. A framed photo on the mantel caught her eye, a picture taken just moments after Ethan's birth, before the doubts and accusations had begun. In it, Greg was looking down at Ethan with pure love, while Rachel gazed at both of them, exhausted but radiant. "We've come full circle," Rachel mused, picking up the frame. Greg wrapped his arms around her from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder. "We have," he agreed. "But I think we're stronger now, don't you?" Rachel nodded, setting the photo back down. Stronger, wiser, and more in love than ever. As they climbed the stairs to their bedroom, Rachel felt a sense of peace settle over her. The past year had been a roller coaster of emotions, filled with challenges they never could have anticipated. But standing here now, with Greg by her side and Ethan sleeping peacefully in the next room, she knew that every struggle had been worth it. Their love story wasn't perfect. It was messy, complicated, and at times painful. But it was real, and it was theirs. As Rachel drifted off to sleep that night, Greg's arms wrapped securely around her, she knew that whatever the future held, they would face it together, as a family, bound by love, trust, and the unbreakable bond they had forged through adversity. And in the nursery next door, little Ethan slept soundly, his bright blue eyes closed in peaceful slumber, a living testament to the enduring power of love and the beauty of second chances. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to our channel. Now, how about another one? To watch another nice story, just click on the video appearing on your screen.